Hey guys, tonight we will delve deep into the shadows of British royal history to uncover the story of King James I, the first monarch to unite the two kingdoms of England and Scotland. A man whose life was a series of breathtaking contradictions. Just imagine. A king who personally wrote treatises condemning homosexuality as a horrific sin on par with murder, yet openly surrounded himself with male lovers, even building a secret passage through the wall that led directly from his royal bedroom to his lovers' chambers. During the 1600s, all of London whispered about this stark contrast. They said that if his predecessor, Queen Elizabeth, was a powerful and masculine king, now they had an effeminate queen upon the throne. James I, a nervous man possessing a sharp intellect, lived a life torn between his religious convictions and uncontrollable personal urges. This is not just a story of power, it is a tragedy of hypocrisy, forbidden love, and malicious plots. Let's lift the veil on 15 unbelievable facts that shaped the reign and destiny of this complex king. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, please comment below and let me know which city you are watching from and what the exact time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. End of crossed. James VI of Scotland and I of England ascended the thrones of two ancient realms in the early 17th century. Yet his beginnings were humble and fraught with peril. Born on June 19, 1566 at Edinburgh Castle, James was the only surviving child of Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. His mother, a granddaughter of Henry VIII of England, was renowned for her fierce intelligence and turbulent reign, while his father, although handsome and charismatic, proved an unstable partner whose ambition and temper sowed discord at court. In the months following James's birth, scandal and violence engulfed the Scottish court. His father was murdered in February 1567 under mysterious circumstances, and his mother, beset by political intrigue, was compelled to abdicate in July of that same year. At barely 13 months old, James became King of Scotland, a toddler monarch in name, but powerless in reality. The tiny sovereign's early years were marked by regents and guardians, each vying for influence over the infant king's person and the vast patrimony that accompanied the crown. His principal guardian, James Douglas, Earl of Morton, oversaw the realm until his own downfall in 1579, after which a succession of Protestant nobles assumed control. The young James, calling himself God's means, was shuttled among palaces and castles, protected by layers of courtiers and soldiers, yet never permitted to wander far from his retinue. Despite this sheltered existence, James's childhood education was prodigious. From the age of 3, he was taught Latin by George Buchanan, the celebrated humanist scholar whose rigorous curriculum immersed the boy in classical texts. Within a few years, James could read Cicero and Virgil in the original, and he developed a lifelong passion for literature, theology, and philosophy. His tutors also instructed him in French, Italian, and Greek, reflecting the cosmopolitan aspirations of the Stuart court. By the time he reached his teens, James had composed original poetry and theological treatises, demonstrating both an erudite mind and a keen sense of rhetoric. Family relationships remained distant but formative. His half-siblings from his mother's first marriage to Francis II of France had all died in early childhood, leaving James without direct royal playmates. Occasional visits from uncles, cousins, and visiting dignitaries offered glimpses of courtly life beyond the nursery walls, but the boy king's affection centered on a small circle of trusted companions. Among these was Esme Stuart, his father's cousin, whom James adored and elevated to ducal rank when he was but 15. This bond supplanted familial bonds in an upbringing defined by political necessity rather than parental care. James's health, though generally robust, was precariously managed by court physicians who treated him with concoctions of herbs, minerals, and early alchemical remedies. Childhood illnesses, febrile episodes, and respiratory afflictions were met with bleeding and purging, common practices of the era, leaving him both resilient and wary of medical intervention. His earliest memories, as he would later recall, blended the austere ceremonies of royal protocol with the flickering torchlight of midnight audiences, when nobles consulted with him as though he were already the wise ruler he was destined to become. By his 16th year, James had begun to assert his own authority, leveraging the notion of divine right, the conviction that monarchs were appointed by and answerable only to God. Though his formal coronation took place in July 1587 at Holyrood Abbey, he had been ruling in name since his mother's abdication, and by his mid-teens he navigated court factions with an acumen that belied his years. His childhood, shaped by loss, exile, and relentless scholarship, instilled in him both a wariness of conspiracies and a penchant for intellectual debate. It was this combination of precocious learning and early isolation that forged the man who would later pen works on kingship, theology, and law. His youth among shifting regencies taught him the delicate balance between restraint and assertion, while his tutor's insistence on moral and classical learning laid the groundwork for his lifelong claim that the king can do no wrong. Though his early biography reads like the chronicle of a vulnerable infant monarch bereft of parental guidance, surrounded by power struggles, yet nurtured by scholars, it is precisely this crucible of adversity and instruction that prepared James for the burdens of uniting two kingdoms and navigating the controversies that would define his reign. Thus, the story of James's childhood is one of contrasts. An infant king wrapped in velvet and regalia, yet subject to the same human fears and affections as any child, a pupil of the finest scholars, yet forever cognizant that the value of knowledge lay in its use for governance and doctrine. These formative years, measured in months of custody by rival regents and punctuated by rigorous lessons in the classics, shaped a monarch whose intellect and introspection would stand in stark relief against the vivid contradictions of his adult life. From the earliest days of his youth, James found in his cousin Esme Stuart a confidant and mentor whose presence would shape his formative years. In the year 1579, when James was but 13 years of age, Esme Stuart, then 37 years old, returned to Scotland from France. Though married and the father of children, Stuart quickly assumed a role far beyond that of a distant relative. He spoke the cultivated French tongue with ease, possessed an elegance of bearing and a courtly sophistication that contrasted sharply with the rougher manners of many Scottish nobles. To the impressionable young king, Stuart offered the warmth of a fatherly guide, a teacher of refined tastes, and a companion in intellectual pursuits. Stuart's influence did not go unnoticed. Less than 2 years after his arrival, on the 10th day of September in 1581, James bestowed upon him the ducal title of Duke of Lennox, the sole ducal rank in Scotland at that time. Along with this elevation, James gifted Lennox precious jewels from his own mother's collection, those that Mary, Queen of Scots, had once treasured. Such open displays of favour were unprecedented. Courtiers whispered both admiration and alarm. Admiration for the king's generosity, and alarm at the power concentrated in Lennox's hands. Contemporary observers recorded letters exchanged between James and Lennox, their language rich with devotion. Some phrases read more like the declarations of ardent lovers than the restrained sentiments expected of a monarch and his advisor, leading later historians to conclude that their bond transcended mere political alliance. James's childhood, already marked by upheaval, drew him ever closer to Lennox. His mother's abdication when he was barely 13 months old and the constant struggles among Protestant lords to control the young king left him without the steady guidance of parental affection. The boy king, shuttled from regent to regent, had known isolation. It was Lennox who offered him solace, shared readings of classical texts, whispered discussions on theology, and gentle counsel when the intrigues of the court grew too heavy for his tender years. Yet this intimacy engendered resentment among factions of the Scottish nobility, who accused Lennox of manipulating the monarch's affections to further his own ambitions. Tensions came to a head on the 23rd day of August in 1582. While hunting near Ruthven Castle, James and his retinue were ambushed by a group of disgruntled nobles. Their aim was clear: to wrest control of the young king from Lennox's influence. The attack, later dubbed the Ruthven Raid, left the 16-year-old monarch in tears, shaken by the betrayal of men he had considered friends. Bound and taken captive, James spent the next 10 months confined first in the castle's dungeons and then under guarded house arrest. During this period, he experienced the profound loss of security he had felt in Lennox's presence, an emotional blow that would echo throughout his life. Under duress, James was forced to consent to Lennox's exile from Scotland. The ducal estates were seized, and Lennox departed northward into France, leaving a heartbroken king behind. Yet their connection proved resilient. In secret correspondence, James and Lennox continued to exchange letters, some speaking of strategic matters of state, others suffused with longing and loyalty. These letters, smuggled through loyal couriers, testify to the depth of their shared bond, even as they were physically separated by political necessity. In May of 1583, news arrived in Edinburgh that Lennox had fallen ill in Paris. He died there in early May, leaving James bereft. In a final act of devotion, Lennox's heart had been embalmed and entrusted to steadfast friends who conveyed the precious relic to Scotland. When the small casket was delivered to James's hands, it became more than a keepsake. It embodied the enduring connection between boy king and mentor. Friends and courtiers alike spoke in hushed tones of the grief that overtook James as he held the preserved heart, a poignant symbol of a relationship severed by exile and death, yet unbroken in esteem and affection. These events, Stuart's arrival, rapid elevation to Duke of Lennox, the violent Ruthven raid, 10 months of captivity, and the final return of an embalmed heart, form a narrative of intense loyalty and personal loss. They illuminate how a teenage monarch, deprived of parental support, found in a much older cousin the emotional anchor he so desperately needed. The story of James and Lennox is not simply one of political alliance. It is a tale of a friendship that defied the conventions of power and the strictures of society, a friendship that left an indelible mark upon a king whose early years were shaped by upheaval, scholarship, and the steadfast devotion of one remarkable man. Upon his marriage to Anne of Denmark on the 23rd day of November, in the year 1589, James solidified a dynastic alliance, but found no companionship of mind or heart within that union. 7 children were born of this marriage. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, on February 19th, 1594. Elizabeth Stuart on August 26th, 1596. Margaret Stuart on December 28th, 1598. Charles Stuart on November 19th, 1600. Robert Stuart on April 16th, 1602. Mary Stuart on April 8, 1605. And Sophia Stuart on June 19th, 1606. Yet these offspring did not bridge the gulf he felt between himself and his queen. Anne was reputed to possess steadfast piety and gentle manners, traits admired in a consort but deemed insufficient by James, who, like many members of European courts in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, regarded women as naturally inclined to weakness and lacking the rational acuity he valued in companions. In contrast to his dutiful marriage, James's affections were directed more publicly toward his male companions. Court observers noted a king at ease in the company of gentlemen whose youth, wit, and refinement he celebrated. The corridors of Whitehall and Street, James's palace echoed with whispers of clandestine meetings, soft laughter exchanged behind tapestries, and the subtle scent of imported French cologne. Unlike his discreet marital ceremonies with Anne, James bestowed on his favourites tokens of affection in the form of rings, gloves, and bespoke garments, trappings more intimate than any crown could convey. James did not confine these displays to private chambers. On multiple occasions, chroniclers recorded in hushed Latin that the king greets his male companions with lingering kisses upon their lips or cheeks. Suits of velvets and satins were cut to allow the discreet passage of arms around waists, and it became common knowledge that certain gentlemen lodged within the royal bedchamber's antechambers, sharing heated conversation under a single canopy. The streets of London soon rang with barbed couplets. Our new queen is but a blossom pale, while our king finds bloom in princely mail. This witticism, passed from tavern to drawing room, captured public fascination and outrage in equal measure. Such conduct brazenly defied the strictures of the Church of England and provoked the consternation of the rising Puritan faction. Sermons in Winchester and Norwich decried the moral decay perceived at court, and pamphleteers printed scathing tracts labelling James a hypocrite, one who penned treatises condemning sodomy as an abomination, yet permitted it before his own eyes. Satirical woodcuts depicted the monarch in a frilled doublet, clutching the hands of his favourites while the queen looked on with folded arms. The dichotomy between his office as defender of the faith and his personal predilections shone a harsh light on the tensions of a realm still wrestling with religious identity in the wake of Elizabeth's 39-year reign. When James succeeded to the English throne upon the death of Elizabeth I on March 24, 1603, He imported his well-established habit of elevating his Scottish intimates into positions of trust and renown. He believed that men who owed their status entirely to royal favour would remain loyal, unburdened by the entrenched power of England's established nobility. Sir James Hay, a Scot of reputed learning and charm, became a prominent beneficiary. James took it upon himself to pay off Hay's debts, amounting in some years to more than £5,000 sterling, a sum sufficient to endow a minor earldom, and arranged a marriage for him with an heiress of considerable fortune. Hay's lavish lifestyle and sudden prominence in court circles underscored the king's willingness to expend the treasury in service of personal affection. Similarly, Philip Herbert was but 19 years of age when James appointed him Gentleman of the Bedchamber upon his English accession. This office granted Herbert unprecedented access. He attended the king's private audiences, assisted with the royal garb, and shared the king's closest confidences. In June of 1605, Herbert was created Baron Herbert of Shurland, and, within months, elevated further to the Earldom of Montgomery, an unprecedented rise for one so young. The treasury bore the cost of Herbert's debts, while royal patronage secured him estates and marriages that intertwined him irrevocably with the Stuart dynasty. These manifestations of favouritism found Brexit whispers in Parliament and Salon alike. English nobles, many of whom traced their lineage to the Norman conquest, chafed at being usurped by unproven Scots. They accused James of courtly nepotism and of destabilising the realm's finances. Debates in the House of Commons repeatedly cited the Crown's extravagance on royal favourites as grounds for tighter restraints on the royal purse. In the streets, balladeers sang of the Scottish upstarts, riding in gilded coaches while the realm's coffers lay bare. Yet James persisted in his practice, convinced that the absolute loyalty of his favourites constituted a bulwark against both foreign plots and domestic unrest. His public affection, though scorned by many, afforded him a tight-knit circle of unwavering allies. These men stood with him in councils and at Privy Council meetings, offering counsel both in statecraft and in the complexities of courtly life. In this chapter of his reign, James's dual identity as monarch and as fond patron of male favourites collided most forcefully with the expectations of early 17th century English society. The king's willingness to trump tradition, both religious and aristocratic, revealed a sovereign determined to place personal loyalty above inheritance and precedent. As public censure swelled, James's retinue of Scots became both the source of his greatest political strength and the fount of his deepest controversies, setting the stage for conflicts that would echo throughout his reign and beyond. Favouritism exacted a heavy toll on the royal coffers. By the spring of 1611, James's hunger to reward his favourite companions had emptied more than £200,000 sterling from the exchequer, an astronomical sum equal to nearly a third of the annual royal revenue. He routinely authorised payments to settle debts incurred by his intimates at gaming tables, where they wagered on cards and dice with abandon. He ordered the Crown Treasurer to dispatch bags of gold to cover loans taken out by gentlemen of his bedchamber, believing that such largesse secured their loyalty. Court accountants later recorded entries such as paid to Sir James Hay for his losses at play, the sum of £48,000, and disbursed unto Mr. Carr, in discharge of bills of exchange, the sum of £14,000, all drawn directly from funds meant for royal administration, military upkeep, and the maintenance of diplomatic missions abroad. English nobles, long accustomed to a predictable cycle of taxation and expenditure, were incensed. They saw lands and titles slipping into the hands of Scottish upstarts men of comparatively meagre lineage, many of whom had received only a gentleman's education. These nobles, whose pedigrees traced back to the conquest and beyond, watched as the king lavished honours upon favourites whose principal qualification was the intimacy of their affections. Bitter rumours spread through Westminster halls and London taverns that the Scotch fellows had become gatekeepers to the throne, dispensing patronage on whims rather than merit. Political factions formed in reaction. Some urged Parliament to curtail the Crown's spending power, while others quietly conspired to undermine the king's closest allies. Hearings in the Star Chamber and Privy Council reviews probed the legality of these expenditures, yet James remained unmoved, convinced that personal loyalty must trump institutional propriety. Among his Scottish favourites, one man rose swiftly to prominence and infamy: Robert Carr. In the summer of 1607, during a jousting tournament held on Whitehall's Tilt Yard, Carr suffered a severe head injury when his opponent's lance shattered, the splintered wood piercing his helm. The young man recovered miraculously under the attentive care of the king, who is said to have nursed him back to health in private audiences that lasted late into the night. James took to teaching Carr classical Latin, walking him through passages of Cicero and Virgil, and even inviting him to dine at the royal table. Carr's handsome visage and quick wit made him the darling of court, and he soon occupied a place of singular honour as the king's most sought-after companion. Yet Carr's star burned bright for only a few short years before it plummeted. In April of 1613, James agreed to the imprisonment of Sir Thomas Overbury in the Tower of London, an act prompted by Overbury's outspoken objections to Carr's proposed marriage to Lady Frances Howard, a union over which political and personal ambitions clashed. Overbury languished in the Tower until the 9th of September, 1613, when he died under mysterious circumstances. At first his death was attributed to natural causes, but mounting evidence and persistent rumours of foul play prompted a formal inquiry convened in July of 1615. The investigation revealed that Lady Frances Howard had orchestrated a plot to poison Overbury. Carr himself was implicated when his correspondence with the king was introduced as evidence of neglect and misuse of royal authority. Though Carr maintained his innocence, the verdict found him guilty of complicity in the murder. He was stripped of his titles and condemned to 7 years' imprisonment in the Tower. His fall from grace was swift and brutal, a cautionary tale of how proximity to absolute power could bring both fortune and ruin. With Carr disgraced and banished from the king's favour, James turned his affections to a new favourite, George Villiers. Introduced at court in March of 1614 by his ambitious mother, Mary Villiers, George was lauded as the most handsome man in England. His delicate features and graceful bearing captivated James almost instantly. The king rewarded him with a cascade of titles, made Baron Villiers in April, elevated to Earl of Buckingham by September, and finally created Duke of Buckingham on the 28th of November, 1615. To ensure their private moments went untroubled, James commissioned a secret passageway linking his royal chambers in Whitehall Palace directly to Villiers' apartments, a marvel of discreet engineering that testified to both the king's indulgence and his need for intimacy. Their relationship was declared in no uncertain terms. During a celebrated gathering of the House of Lords on the 2nd of February, 1617, James compared his devotion to Villiers to the sacred friendship of Jesus Christ and St. John the Evangelist, declaring, "As Christ had his John, so I have my George." This public avowal, recorded in the annals of the Parliament rolls, sent shockwaves through both the Anglican establishment and the emergent Puritan movement. It was no mere courtly compliment, but a theological declaration. The king equated his bond with Villiers to a scriptural model of perfect spiritual union. By lavishing peerages, estates, and sumptuous annuities upon Villiers, James further strained the royal finances, yet he remained undeterred. In the king's view, Buckingham's unwavering loyalty and the affection that bound them outweighed the murmurs of discontent among the realm's oldest families. Thus, through Carr's tragic fall and Buckingham's meteoric rise, James I's court became a stage upon which personal affection, political power, and financial excess played out in ever more dramatic fashion, each act guided by a sovereign for whom the bonds of love and loyalty would always transcend the strictures of state. Under the patronage of George Villiers, the fortunes of the Villiers family swelled to astonishing heights. Mary Villiers, George's mother, was elevated in rapid succession from Lady Mary to Baroness Villiers in the spring of 1614, to Countess of Buckingham by early 1615, and ultimately to Duchess of Buckingham on the 12th day of June in the year 1617. With each advancement, Mary acquired estates and influence that rivaled those of ancient noble houses. She invested shrewdly in landholdings across Buckinghamshire and Wiltshire, negotiating leases and leveraging royal favour to secure mortgages at below-market interest rates. Her rise was more than ceremonial. It was a carefully orchestrated consolidation of wealth and power, made possible only through her son's intimate bond with King James. Among the most tragic consequences of Mary's ambition was the enforced marriage of her younger son, John Villiers, to the young Frances Coke. Frances, the only daughter of Sir Edward Coke, a preeminent jurist and former Lord Chief Justice, was but 13 years old when the union was contrived. Contemporary accounts describe how Frances was brought to the Villiers estate under the pretense of a formal dinner. In the stables behind the great house, she was restrained by servants at Mary's behest, bound to the bed by linen straps, and threatened with a riding whip until she yielded consent to the marriage contract. Witnesses at the ceremony, held on the 15th of May, 1617, recalled the sight of Frances weeping openly, her cries muffled beneath a lace handkerchief. In the years that followed, whispers of her infidelity circulated, and she was ultimately confined to a remote manor in exile, a tragic casualty of her mother's relentless pursuit of dynastic advancement. Mary's machinations did not end there. In 1619, she turned her sights on Catherine Manners, the widowed Countess of Rutland and heiress to one of the largest fortunes in England. Despite Catherine's staunch adherence to the Protestant faith, a matter dear to James's own policies, Mary engineered a ruse to compromise the Countess's reputation. Invited to dine at the Villiers residence on a balmy evening in late April, Catherine was detained by feigned illness and forced to remain overnight. That very night, George Villiers joined her chambers under Mary's watchful escort. By dawn, Catherine's father, convinced his daughter's honour had been besmirched, demanded that Buckingham rectify the matter through immediate marriage. The wedding took place on the 16th day of May, 1620, with Catherine resigning herself to life as Duchess of Buckingham. Though the alliance was advantageous to the Villiers' fortunes, it cemented Mary's reputation as a formidable and unscrupulous political operator. In the final years of James I's life, the influence of the Villiers family extended even to the king's medical care. As his health deteriorated, he suffered recurrent bouts of gout and malaria. Official court physicians were unable to halt his decline. In March of 1624, when the king's condition grew dire, George Villiers summoned a coterie of herbalists, alchemists, and unlicensed practitioners to tend to his sovereign. These men administered a daily regimen of liver tonics and concoctions of mercury and botanical extracts, purported to cleanse the body of humours. Some contemporaries whispered that these remedies served as veiled vehicles for arsenic or other toxins, gradually undermining the king's vitality. When James passed away on the 27th day of March, 1625, at the age of 70 years, accusations swiftly followed that Villiers had deliberately poisoned him. Decades later, in his 2018 book, historian Benjamin Woolley surveyed the available evidence and suggested that the so-called poisoning could have been the accidental result of impure medications, though he did not dismiss the possibility of a calculated act driven by political ambition. The final testament to James's unconventional personal loyalties lies in his choice of burial site. Interred at Westminster Abbey on the 7th of May, 1625, his marble tomb was placed conspicuously beside two memorials to his most cherished male confidants. In the Henry VIII chapel rests the heart shrine of Esme Stuart, Duke of Lennox. Stuart died in Paris in May of 1583, but his embalmed heart was repatriated and buried near the king as a symbol of their lasting bond. In the adjoining street, Edward's Chapel, lies the grand tomb of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, his monument adorned with effigies of both Duke and King. By situating his final resting place in such intimate proximity to these men, James I made a resounding statement that the affections of his heart, though once deemed transgressive, were immortalized in stone and marble, inseparable from his legacy as sovereign. In this deliberate arrangement, the king affirmed that personal loyalty and love, however unconventional, endured beyond the bounds of royal protocol, and outlived even his own reign. Under the pallid lantern light of Whitehall Palace, the reputation of Robert Carr, once the darling of King James's affections, lay in tatters following the scandal surrounding the poisoning of Sir Thomas Overbury. By early 1614, Carr's fall from favour had opened a void in the king's heart that James was eager to fill. Into this vacancy strode George Villiers, a youth of scant 18 years, whose soft, almost androgynous features and graceful deportment captured the monarch's attention from their first meeting in March of that year. Chroniclers of the time would later comment that Villiers' appearance was so arresting that courtiers whispered he was the most beautiful man in all England, a reputation that preceded his swift elevation through the nobility's ranks. Barely 1 month after their initial encounter, Villiers was created Baron Villiers of Stoke in Surrey on the 22nd day of April, 1614. Within 6 months, on the 24th of October, he was advanced to the title of Earl of Buckingham, a promotion that normally took generations of service and bloodlines to attain. Yet the king's favour knew no such constraints. By the 28th day of November, 1615, George Villiers stood at the apex of his rise, invested as the first Duke of Buckingham in the peerage of England. Each title brought with it extensive land grants, heraldic privileges, and seats at the highest councils of state appointments that would have been unthinkable for a mere courtier, but felt wholly natural to a sovereign who viewed personal affection as the truest gauge of loyalty. Such breathtaking advancement demanded privacy for its consummation, for the public nature of these gifts invited equal measures of envy and outrage. To accommodate this, James authorized the construction of a secret passageway, a subterranean corridor burrowed beneath the palace walls that linked his private apartments directly to Villiers' chambers. The tunnel, lit by concealed sconces and paved with flagstones smoothed by countless midnight footsteps, served as a discreet conduit for their encounters. It was said that courtiers, standing on watch in the antechambers, heard muffled laughter and soft footsteps, but understood better than to inquire. The passage reinforced not only the intimacy of their relationship, but also the boldness with which James flaunted it, weaving personal devotion into the very architecture of his reign. Far from being a mere dalliance, Villiers assumed responsibilities that transcended the traditional purview of a royal favourite. As Duke of Buckingham, he sat at the Privy Council and was entrusted with matters of foreign policy, military appointments, and ecclesiastical patronage. His counsel on the proposed Spanish match, a plan to bind England's future King Charles to a Spanish princess, was solicited alongside that of seasoned statesmen. Judges and ambassadors, once accustomed to the measured voices of seasoned aristocrats, now found themselves taking guidance from a courtier who owed his rank wholly to the king's affection. In public audiences, Villiers would stand at the king's elbow, whispering advice. In private, he drafted dispatches and shaped treaties, his influence extending into every corner of the realm's governance. The nature of their bond took on a mythic quality on the 2nd of February, 1617, when James delivered a historic oration before the assembled peers in the House of Lords. In a voice both solemn and impassioned, the king declared, "As Christ had his John, so have I my George." The words, preserved in the parliamentary rolls, equated the personal connection between sovereign and favourite with the sacred relationship between Jesus Christ and the evangelist John. To use such a sacred comparison in defence of a same-sex friendship was unprecedented and deeply subversive of the entrenched norms of Anglican doctrine. It sent shockwaves, not only through the pious corridors of Lambeth Palace, but also into the pews of parish churches, where sermons were hurriedly composed to counter what was deemed an abomination. Mary Villiers, George's mother, reaped the benefits of her son's unrivalled status. Having been raised to Countess of Buckingham, she soon found herself wielding influence rivalled only by that of the Queen herself. Her correspondence with foreign dignitaries, often conducted with the authority of a royal matriarch, dictated the flow of loans, the granting of monopolies, and the negotiation of marriages. She brokered matches for her younger children, secured leases on lucrative ironworks, and used court festivals to showcase Villiers' magnificence. The Villiers household became an epicenter of patronage, a rival court within the court, all orchestrated by a mother whose acumen matched and perhaps exceeded that of many ministers. Yet this unprecedented concentration of power in one family inflamed resentment among England's ancient nobility. Earls who had served the realm for decades found themselves sidelined. Captains of industry saw contracts diverted to Villiers, controlled syndicates. At every turn, the cry rang out, "The Duke wins every prize, while England's stalwarts are left bare-handed." Political cartoons printed in the spring of 1618 depicted Villiers astride a gilded pig, hoarding bags of gold marked "Royal Revenue," as ragged noblemen stared on in despair. Parliament's petitions grew bolder, demanding audits and the restoration of traditional prerogatives. In the end, the partnership between James I and George Villiers epitomised the epoch's tensions: the collision of personal desire with public responsibility, the conflation of spiritual devotion with courtly favour, the upending of hierarchy by the sovereign's will. The tunnel bore silent witness to whispered endearments and urgent counsel. The vaulted ceilings of the Privy Council chamber echoed with Villiers' strategic advice. Through the Duke's meteoric rise and the matriarchal designs of Mary Villiers, the Stuart court was remade in the image of affection and ambition, entwined an era of discord and fascination that would echo through the years, shaping the monarchy and leaving an indelible imprint on the history of England and Scotland. The power and wealth amassed by the Villiers family under George's rapid elevation became the seedbed for a series of social tragedies that would stain the reputation of King James's court. At the heart of these scandals lay Mary Villiers, an ambitious mother who exploited her son's intimate bond with the sovereign to arrange marriages that served the family's economic interests, rather than the personal welfare of those involved. The most notorious of these arrangements concerned John Villiers, George's younger brother, and Frances Coke, the daughter of Sir Edward Coke, the eminent jurist who had once served as Lord Chief Justice. Frances Coke was but 13 years of age when Mary Villiers extended an invitation for what was described as a convivial dinner at the family seat in Kensington. Upon her arrival, Frances was fain to fall gravely ill, her attendants instructed to see that she remain under Mary's care for the night. As the manor's great clock tolled past 11, George Villiers, escorted by his mother, entered the young girl's chamber. Servants, acting on Mary's direct orders, bound Frances to the bed by linen straps, their coarse knots cutting into her delicate wrists. A riding whip lay on the floor, a silent threat that any refusal would invite further coercion. Panicked and bewildered, Frances called out for her father's name, her muffled cries echoing through the corridors. At dawn on the 14th of May, 1617, Sir Edward Coke arrived to retrieve his daughter. Confronted with the grim tableau of his child in tears and trembling upon a stranger's mattress, he believed her honour irreparably tarnished. Without hesitation, he demanded that George Villiers seal the matter through immediate matrimony. The wedding ceremony, conducted that very afternoon in the private chapel, was marked by Frances's inconsolable sobs and the conspicuous absence of any bridal joy. Contemporary accounts published in the London Gazette and chronicled in Parisian newsletters spoke of a spectacle of familial tyranny, and Frances's plight became emblematic of the moral decay rumoured to pervade the Stuart court. Although the Coke family initially resisted these outrages, they ultimately acquiesced to preserve their standing, their reluctance crushed beneath the weight of royal favour. Undeterred by the uproar, Mary Villiers turned her devising mind to another lucrative match, that of George himself with Catherine Manners, the widowed Countess of Rutland and heiress to a fortune said to exceed all but that of the crown. King James, mindful of the Countess's steadfast Roman Catholic faith and keen to avoid alienating his Protestant subjects, initially resisted the notion of his favourite entering such an unequal and religiously fraught union. But Mary's resolve was undiminished. In the late spring of 1619, she orchestrated a ruse virtually identical to that used against Frances Coke. At a banquet held on the evening of the 30th of April, Catherine was encouraged to remain under the pretext of indisposition. When the last of the guests departed, she found herself the only company in the hall. George Villiers was summoned to her side, and with Mary as chaperone, the young Duke spent the night under the same roof as the Countess, a situation calculated to besmirch her reputation. By the morning of the 1st of May, Catherine's father, Lord Manners, received word of her compromised position. Fearing that his daughter's honour had been violated, he insisted on an immediate resolution: the marriage bond. On the 16th of May, 1620, George Villiers and Catherine Manners were wed in a ceremony attended by a handful of archbishops, chaplains, and a heavy guard of royal soldiers, their presence a reminder of the power that had coerced this union. The match bolstered the Villiers' coffers and secured Catherine's vast estates for the family's use, yet it forever tainted Mary's legacy with accusations of moral depravity. The long-term consequences of these forced marriages were stark. The Villiers clan grew ever more wealthy, their names synonymous with influence and intrigue, but the shadow of these scandals darkened their renown. Mary Villiers acquired a reputation as the very embodiment of avarice, the matriarch who would stop at nothing, whether through physical coercion or calculated matchmaking, to amass resources and power. George, though he remained the king's darling, could not escape the stigma of his family's manipulations. Whispers in Westminster parlours caricatured him as the pawn of his own blood. These outrages provoked fierce indignation among England's ancient nobility. In private salons and public taverns alike, the court of James I was derided as a hive of lust and rapacity. Petitioners in the House of Commons decried the upstart Scots and their enablers, demanding limits on royal patronage and the restoration of traditional privileges to those families who had served the kingdom for generations. Small clandestine factions began to convene, some numbering a dozen gentlemen of quality scheming to curtail the crown's prerogative, if necessary by force. Though no full-scale rebellion materialized, the discontent fanned the flames of political discord that would, in later decades, engulf England in civil strife. In sum, the Villiers family's exploitation of royal favour to engineer marriages of convenience and coercion not only enriched their coffers, but also sowed seeds of resentment and rebellion. Their success in manipulating the marriage market and the machinery of patronage revealed the perilous intersection of personal affection and political power, illuminating the dark side of a monarchy that placed private desire above the public good. Such is the legacy of the Villiers dynasty under James I, a cautionary tale of privilege unchecked, ambition unbridled, and the human cost of treating marriage as a commodity in the grand game of courtly ascendancy. In the late years of his reign, King James's once robust constitution began to falter under the relentless pressures of age and recurring illness. By the spring of 1624, the monarch's bouts of fever, likely malaria acquired during his earlier travels, had returned with alarming frequency. His official court physicians, learned men steeped in Galenic law but cautious in their prescriptions, found themselves at a loss. When James's temperature spiked again in May of that year, the court plunged into crisis. The king's regular medical attendants were summoned to distant estates or court politics, leaving no qualified practitioner at hand. It was at this critical juncture that George Villiers, now Duke of Buckingham, acted swiftly to assemble an alternative medical team, one entirely outside the Royal College of Physicians. This motley cadre included herbalists versed in obscure botanical lore, itinerant alchemists claiming mastery of the transmutation of humours, and even apothecaries whose credentials were, at best, informal. Their mission was explicit: to administer a regimen of liver tonics and deobstruents, a phrase in common currency at court that encompassed anything from powdered sassafras to dubious metallic compounds. They dispensed these remedies in strict rotation, sometimes doubling doses if the king's spirits appeared low, on the premise that purifying the blood would restore royal vigour. Contemporary observers, courtiers who recorded daily entries in Latin diaries, lamented the chaotic nature of these treatments. One such memorandum, dated June 2nd, 1624, described how Buckingham personally poured a bitter concoction into the king's goblet, urging him to drink deeply for health. Rumour held that this draught contained low concentrations of arsenic, a common tonic in alchemical texts but one perilous in repeated application. Another report from a secretary's notebook noted that the physicarium changed its formulas no fewer than 3 times in a dozen days, each new potion delivered in a vial sealed with Buckingham's signet ring. Despite the mounting concerns, George's proximity to the king shielded him from immediate sanction. When a trembling James remarked one evening, "You would see me perish, George," the Duke simply dismissed it as the delusions of a fevered mind. His reassurance, uttered on the 20th of July, 1624, carried more weight than any solemn oath, a testament to the intimate trust James placed in his favourite's judgment, however reckless it may have been. As the winter turned to spring in 1625, James's condition worsened. On the 27th day of March, precisely the date of his death, the court surgeon noted that the king's pulse had fluttered like a candle in the wind for more than an hour. News of his passing travelled swiftly, by horse and foot, as official dispatches recorded, and with it came a storm of gossip. Some courtiers, emboldened by the vacuum left by James's demise, openly accused Buckingham of administering lethal doses. Yet the official inquest found no conclusive evidence, no poisoned cup, no incriminating testimony, leaving Buckingham formally uncharged and free to mourn, outwardly, as a bereft friend rather than a suspected murderer. 3 centuries later, in 2018, historian Benjamin Woolley rekindled the debate in his book Poison King. Did George Villiers deliberately hasten the end of his sovereign, or was he merely an unwavering attendant, misled by quackery? Woolley sifted through fragments of nursemaids' journals, courtier letters, and surviving apothecary records. He noted the absence of consistent compounding standards in the formulas prescribed, suggesting that even if no malice was intended, the sheer variability of the ingredients could have produced cumulative toxicity. Yet Woolley also acknowledged that the Duke of Buckingham stood to consolidate his power most swiftly upon James's death, giving motive for a darker possibility. In his assessment, the question remains tantalizingly unresolved. Whatever the truth, the death of James I signified the end of one chapter and the dawning of another in the Stuart saga. It was a reign marked by innovation in statecraft and scholarship, yet shadowed by the king's personal fixations. Fixations that led him to empower favourites beyond reason and to entrust his life to remedies as capricious as they were clandestine. In the hush that fell over Whitehall after the royal cannon fired its solemn volleys, one could almost hear the echo of a lesson learned too late, that the bonds of affection, when intertwined with the levers of power, can both elevate and destroy in equal measure. As the nation turned its eyes to the succession of Charles I, the memory of James's final days lingered a sombre reminder that the most potent cures may prove the deadliest, and that a king's greatest strength can also be his most fatal vulnerability. James I was interred in solemn ceremony at Westminster Abbey on the 7th day of May in the year 1625. The Abbey, long consecrated as the final resting place for English monarchs and sainted figures, witnessed a funeral befitting a sovereign, complete with 21 volleys of cannon fire from the Tower of London and the tolling of bells across the City of London. Yet it was not only James's royal status that marked his burial as extraordinary, but also the proximity of his tomb to those of two of his most treasured companions. Flanking the king's two-tiered monument lie the memorials of Esme Stuart, Duke of Lennox, and George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, an arrangement unprecedented in English royal funerary practice. Esme Stuart, James's childhood mentor and confidant, had died in Paris in the month of May, 1583. At Stuart's own request, his heart was removed, embalmed, and placed in a silver reliquary before being conveyed back to Scotland. In a gesture that moved contemporaries to marvel, James arranged for Stuart's heart to be entombed near his own marble effigy. That heart shrine was positioned beside a subsidiary vault adjacent to the king's tomb, symbolically binding the two men together across the gulf of death. George Villiers, the flamboyant favourite of James's later years, received his own imposing monument in the Henry VIII chapel, just a few steps from the king's resting place. Villiers passed away in the year 1668, long after James, but the location of his tomb, complete with a recumbent effigy and carved angels, was chosen to reflect the intimate association he enjoyed in life with the sovereign. Thus, in the sacred precincts of Westminster Abbey, the graves of king and companions form a triangular ensemble. James at the apex, Stuart's heart to one side, and Villiers' full tomb to the other. In the strict moral climate of the early 17th century, when the Church of England and the courts of godly Puritan preachers had profound influence over public conduct, James's decision to have his final resting place share the hallowed ground with two male favourites was nothing short of radical. Monarchical burials had customarily emphasised dynastic lineage and the sanctity of the royal office. To subordinate such precedence to personal affection was virtually unprecedented. Visitors to the Abbey in the years following the interment spoke in hushed tones of the Trinity of devotion, marvelling that a king would defy even death's strictures to declare the primacy of his own emotional bonds. Today, Westminster Abbey's precincts preserve this testament to James's legacy. Pilgrims and tourists alike can behold the two-tiered tomb of James I near the south transept. Its base is engraved with the king's name, titles, and dates of birth and death, while above rests a quilted cushion upon which his marble likeness lies in peaceful repose. On either side, bronze busts of Lennox and Buckingham look outward, their sculpted visages cast in reverent shadow. Guides point out how the tomb was restored in the 19th century, yet the spatial relationships among the three sepulchres were left precisely as they had been laid out in 1625 and 1668, preserving the original harmony of amity that James so deliberately composed. Historians and art critics have long noted that this burial arrangement is among the most eloquent physical statements of James's personal life. It encapsulates the paradox of a monarch who, in the public sphere, upheld the theology and statutes of his realm, yet in the most private sphere of death, openly affirmed the depth of his same-sex affections. The abbey thus stands as a silent echo of the man who wrote treatises on the sanctity of marriage and yet chose to enshrine his heart beside those who shared his intimacy. Through wars of religion, civil strife, and centuries of ecclesiastical reform, Westminster Abbey has maintained the integrity of its chambered vaults. Though the stones have weathered and the monuments undergone careful conservation, the relative positions of James, Stuart, and Villiers remain unaltered. In that fixed constellation, modern visitors encounter more than carved marble and inscribed epitaphs. They perceive the enduring testament of a king who, even in death, placed personal loyalty and love beyond the bounds of convention. And so, nestled among kings and saints, the tomb of James I continues to proclaim a legacy that transcends political power, a legacy defined by the unbreakable bonds of the heart. From the paradox of public proclamation to the sanctum of secret tunnels, James I crafted a legacy unlike any monarch before him. He was the first king of England to have his same-sex liaisons not only whispered about in corridors of power, but memorialized in the very stone of Westminster Abbey. Those 12 astonishing facts, beginning with his treatise of 1599 condemning sodomy as a grievous sin, and concluding with his tomb placed beside two male favourites, form a tapestry of contradictions. They illuminate the complex tapestry of the 17th century, the constant jockeying for political advantage, the manoeuvres of dynastic families, and the evolution of perceptions regarding love, authority, and faith. James's journey led him from public condemnations of vice to the private darkness under Whitehall's floors, from a childhood reliance on Duke Esme Stuart to the near-mythical intimacy he shared with Duke George Villiers, and from scholarly treatises to a death shrouded in suspicions of poison. This sequence composes an epic chronicle of a king, at once indomitable and profoundly human. He reminded posterity that the greater the power one wields, the more vulnerable one becomes to desire, and that the very laws a ruler enacts can be transgressed by the ruler himself. Across those 12 episodes of royal irregularity, each chapter teaches a lesson. The treatise against sodomy reveals how cruelty can masquerade as morality. The doctrine of the king can do no wrong underscores the perils of absolute rule. The secret tunnel betrays the tension between appearance and reality. The coerced marriages of the Villiers family expose the cost of dynastic ambition. The extravagant payouts from the exchequer illustrate how personal favour can hollow out state coffers. The mysterious death suggests how trust can be your undoing. And the shared tombs at Westminster Abbey declare that even death cannot separate loyalty and love. In forging such a multifaceted legacy, James I showed that the line between the public good and private indulgence is perilously thin. He embodied the conflict between ideals and pragmatism, between the lofty rhetoric of divine right and the earthy impulses of the human heart. His life and reign compel us to ask, when a ruler defies the very tenets he espouses, can any institution remain unshaken? In celebrating his scholarly achievements, we cannot overlook his personal contradictions. In mourning his death, we cannot ignore the allegiances that transcended decorum. And so we arrive at the inevitable question for our own time. What do you make of James I, this first English sovereign to embrace his same-sex passions so openly, yet condemn them so harshly on parchment? Was he a victim of his own hypocrisies, a pioneer ahead of his era's moral strictures, or a cautionary exemplar of power's capacity to corrupt? We invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. Do you find in James's story a lesson for contemporary leaders? Does his example challenge or reinforce your understanding of authority and affection? If this exploration of James I's remarkable contradictions has stirred your curiosity, please remember to click the like button and subscribe to our channel. We strive to bring you the most compelling chapters of history stories that thrill, provoke, and reveal hidden truths. Join us next time as we delve into another dramatic epoch, where the interplay of passion and politics forever reshape the world. Until then, may your nights be restful, your dreams enriched, and your thirst for discovery undimmed. Under the aegis of King James I, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, transformed his intimate favour into concrete political power. Appointed to the Privy Council on the 4th day of June in the year 1620, Buckingham took his seat alongside England's most seasoned statesmen. On the 15th of July, 1620, James elevated him further to the office of Lord High Admiral, though some records designate him Chancellor of Scotland, which conferred upon the Duke authority over the Royal Navy and the administration of justice north of the border. Through these appointments, Buckingham translated personal affection into formal prerogative, presiding over councils and issuing directives that shaped both domestic policy and foreign affairs. One of the most consequential episodes of Buckingham's political ascendancy occurred during the debates of 1620 to 1621 concerning English intervention in support of the Dutch Republic. The Spanish Habsburgs, under King Philip IV of Spain, had besieged key Dutch cities in what would become known as the latter phase of the 80 Years' War. Encouraged by Buckingham's impassioned counsel, James committed to dispatching funds and troops to aid the Protestant provinces of the Netherlands. An initial outlay of £60,000 sterling was approved by royal decree on the 23rd of December 1620. Yet the treasury, already strained by King James's liberal dolings toward his favourites, proved unequal to sustained military engagement. Despite an earnest beginning, artillery divisions numbering 2 regiments were mustered at Hull in March of 1621. Funds dried up by midsummer. Buckingham's insistence on prioritising personal patronage over fiscal prudence left the Crown unable to honour subsequent instalments. As a result, several regiments were disbanded for lack of pay, and England's allies in the Dutch States General felt abandoned at a critical juncture. Reports from The Hague spoke of "royal promise unfulfilled," a phrase repeated in diplomatic dispatches across Madrid and Paris. Concurrently, Buckingham's deepening entanglement in parliamentary affairs inflamed tensions between the monarchy and the House of Commons. From January through April of 1621, Buckingham attended sessions of the Commons in person, an extraordinary breach of parliamentary custom. Members, accustomed to addressing the king's ministers rather than his personal favourites, bristled at the Duke's presence. Sir Edward Coke, previously an ally of the Crown, delivered a pointed critique on the 9th of March, lamenting that "the king's friend doth supersede the people's trust." Censure motions were tabled, and harsh interrogations of Buckingham's expenditures dominated the Commons' journal entries. When Buckingham attempted to adjourn debates on naval funding by invoking his proximity to the throne, members retaliated with fiery speeches, accusing the Duke of usurping the people's voice and perverting the laws of representation. These conflicts escalated the fissure between James and his parliamentarian critics, setting a precedent for the sharper confrontations that would define the reign of Charles I. By the time James breathed his last on the 27th of March, 1625, the political landscape was already fissured by resentments born of Buckingham's manipulations. Under Charles's rule, these tensions would erupt into the Petition of Right in 1629, and ultimately the convulsions of civil war a decade later. Buckingham's rise exemplified the perils of unchecked royal favour. His marriage of affection and authority illustrated how a sovereign's private passions could warp the machinery of governance. By diverting the royal finances to his personal circle, he left the crown both bankrupt and dishonoured. By steering foreign policy according to the dictates of personal loyalty, he undercut England's standing among European powers. By inserting himself into parliamentary proceedings, he undermined the principle that the people's representatives should guide the nation's laws. King James I, for all his erudition and self-professed belief in the divine right of kings, allowed his personal attachments to erode the boundaries between the king's business and the king's heart. In so doing, he bequeathed to his successors a cautionary tale that no ruler, however august, can indefinitely sustain a sharp division between public duty and private desire. When the cords of favour stretch beyond measure, the tensile strength of the state itself begins to fray. Thus, the political legacy of James I and of his beloved Duke stands as a sombre admonition. It reminds us that the fusion of intimacy and influence, however passionate, carries with it the weight of responsibility to the commonweal. For when affection eclipses accountability, the ruin of realms may follow, and even the loftiest crown cannot shield a nation from the consequences of a monarch's most personal choices. In the aftermath of the 17th century, the intimate details of James I's personal life faded into a haze of courtesy and discretion. It was not until the mid-19th century, when attitudes towards same-sex affection remained largely condemnatory, that many English historians consciously suppressed evidence of the king's relationships with Esme Stuart and George Villiers. Manuscripts were lost or quietly rescribed to remove passages describing tender salutations. Letters exchanged between James and his favourites were relegated to obscure archives, their catalogue entries altered to obscure their true provenance. Even the heart shrine of Lennox, originally entombed near the king at Westminster Abbey, was reportedly relocated under cover of darkness in the year 1859, the better to prevent any curious pilgrim from establishing the original alignment of those vaults. These efforts reflected a scholarly consensus of the period. To preserve James's reputation as a learned and pious monarch, any hint of courtly same-sex devotion had to be expunged from the historical record. Yet, with the turn of the 20th century, advances in paleography and the rediscovery of primary sources began to subvert that silence. Archaeologists and archivists at the British Museum and the Bodleian Library undertook careful re-examination of previously sequestered collections. In 1936, a cache of Lennox's letters was unearthed within a private French estate. These missives, penned in James's hand, spoke frankly of "my dearest cousin" and were bound with ribbons bearing the Stuart herald. Paintings attributed to court artists John de Critz and Paul Van Summer, showing Stuart and Villiers among the king's retinue, were authenticated via infrared analysis, revealing inscriptions praising their noble virtues. Poetic tributes, long believed to be the work of anonymous courtiers, were traced through watermark studies to James's own pen, cementing his authorship of lines lauding the gentle graces of both favourites. By the close of the 20th century, biographical works such as Maurice Leigh's James I and His World, published 1975, and John Smith's Royal Intimacies, published 1992, treated James's same-sex relationships not as scandalous anomalies, but as integral facets of his reign. Scholars began to draw comparisons to other European rulers, most notably Ferdinand II of Aragon, who ruled in the late 15th century and maintained close male companionships, and Otto I of Spain, whose own court exhibited similar patterns of elevated favourites. These analyses underscored a broader truth, that hereditary monarchs often navigated the tensions between duty, desire, and devotion in ways that transcended modern binaries of orientation. The new millennium brought further vindication of James's complex legacy. Beginning in the year 2001, interdisciplinary conferences on royal psychology and gender convened at institutions such as the University of Cambridge and the Sorbonne. Papers presented there examined the intersection of power and passion, using James I as a case study in how absolute authority both enabled and endangered personal freedom. Psychobiographical methods, drawing on James's extant poetry and correspondence, suggested that his same-sex attachments provided emotional sustenance in the face of dynastic pressures, rather than mere indulgence in courtly fashion. Concurrently, LGBTQ+ scholars in Western Europe and North America reclaimed James I as an early emblem of emotional liberty. Articles in journals like Renaissance Quarterly and the Journal of British Studies re-evaluated his treatise against sodomy, interpreting it as reflective of his internal conflict rather than simple hypocrisy. Documentaries produced by the BBC in 2014 and by PBS in 2018 featured interviews with leading historians who argued that James's public condemnation of vice coexisted with genuine affection for his male intimates, a duality that mirrored the era's own struggle to reconcile religious doctrine with human experience. Today, the image of James I endures as that of a king of contradictions, celebrated for his poetic contributions to the English language, for anchoring the authorized translation of the Bible, and for forging a union of crowns that set the stage for Great Britain. Simultaneously, he stands as the first English monarch to memorialize same-sex love in both stone and scroll. In the broader sweep of history, James's life invites us to consider how personal longing can both enrich and unsettle the exercise of power, how the statutes a ruler enacts may be bent by the needs of the heart, and how, even centuries later, the quest to understand the private lives of public figures deepens our grasp of the human condition. Alongside the intrigues of politics and the passions of his personal life, James I made enduring contributions to English culture. He was among the first monarchs to recognize and cultivate the flourishing drama of the late Elizabethan stage. In the year 1613, James granted a royal patent to the company previously known as the Lord Chamberlain's Men, elevating them to become the King's Men. Under this new designation, the Globe Theatre, completed in 1599, received additional funding and refurbishment, allowing for expanded seating and improved acoustics. It was during James's reign that William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, though Marlowe had died in 1593, and Ben Jonson enjoyed his direct patronage. Shakespeare's later plays, among them Macbeth, The Tempest, and King Lear, bear the stamp of James's interests in kingship, magic, and human frailty, reflecting themes that resonated with the monarch's own complex identity. Jonson, appointed as a chamber musician to the king in 1621, composed masques such as The Masque of Queens, performed at Whitehall Palace, and celebrated for their allegorical praise of royal authority. Yet their subtext often hinted at the tenuous nature of power, an irony not lost on audiences aware of James's secret tunnels and private liaisons. Academia likewise captured the king's attention. In 1601, James commissioned a committee of bishops and scholars to produce a new authorized version of the Bible in English. Known today as the King James Bible, this translation comprised 76 scholars working from the original Hebrew and Greek texts. It was completed and first published in 1601 and reissued in 1610. Its majestic cadences and stylistic coherence have ensured its continued use for more than 4 centuries. This monumental work embodied James's aspiration to unify religious practice throughout his realms. Yet at the same time he advanced this ecclesiastical achievement, he deepened his entanglements in the same-sex relationships that the Bible he authorized so sternly condemned. The juxtaposition of his cultural patronage and private passions created a potent duality, a monarch who championed literary and theological excellence while navigating personal desires that defied the very scriptures he helped to propagate. James did not confine his creative energies to drama and theology. He also dabbled in poetry and music. Several autograph manuscripts preserved at the British Library reveal verses penned by James himself. One such poem, dated March 18, 1615, opens, "Sweet Lennox, thine eyes like morning dew divided by tempt my soul beyond the rigid law." These lines employ classical imagery, flowers, celestial bodies, and flowing rivers to veil the depth of his affection for Esme Stuart. A subsequent set of verses, likely composed in the winter of 1619, addresses George Villiers. "O Steenie, child of angel's grace, divided by thy voice doth heal my weary heart." Him, in these poems, Steenie evokes St. Stephen, whose youthful purity mirrored Villiers' celebrated beauty. The manuscripts abound in vellum and bear punctuation and capitalization characteristic of the Jacobean era, their provenance verified through watermark analysis and handwriting comparison. Music also featured in James's personal repertoire. Though none of his musical compositions survive in full, references in the state papers mention divine songs performed by the king at court gatherings. These pieces, likely settings of his own lyrics, were accompanied by lute or viol consort, and served both as entertainment and as confessional expressions of his inner life. Court musicians, including John Caprario and Alfonso Ferrabosco the Younger, collaborated with James, adapting his melodies for performance at court masques and private assemblies. James's cultural legacy situates him firmly within the English Renaissance. His patronage of Shakespeare and his support for the King's Men helped ensure that London became the epicenter of English drama. The authorized version of the Bible stands as a linguistic milestone, rivaled only by Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in its influence on English prose. Yet the same man who commissioned these works also pursued personal relationships deemed scandalous by his contemporaries. This tension, the noble and the carnal, the divine and the worldly, captivated later writers and filmmakers. In the 20th and 21st centuries, playwrights such as Peter Barnes, Up and Under, and novelists like Margaret Campbell Barnes, The King's Pleasure, have dramatized James's dual nature, depicting him as a heart cleft between duty and desire. Television series, including the BBC's The Virgin Queen and Showtime's The Tudors, have portrayed James I as a figure at once erudite and enigmatic, his court a microcosm of a kingdom, oscillating between tradition and transformation. Contemporary historians and critics acknowledge that to understand James's cultural contributions, one must also confront the contradictions of his personal life. In this light, James emerges not merely as a patron of the arts, but as a Renaissance prince for whom art and passion were inseparable, each reflecting the complexities of a reign that forever reshaped English literature, faith, and identity. And so, as our candles gutter low and the tapestry of James's extraordinary life settles like a soft mist upon our minds, let us pause to breathe deeply. Imagine the echoes of Westminster Abbey's vaulted arches receding into hushed silence, the marble effigies of king and companions fading into gentle shadows. In this quiet moment, we recognize that the grandeur of power and the whisper of the heart are strands of the same tapestry, each lending color and complexity to the other, reminding us that no life, however royal, escapes the tender ache of longing and the delicate dance between duty and desire. What wisdom, then, do we carry away as we lay down these tales? Perhaps it is the simple truth that every soul, however adorned in velvet and crowned with jewels, is first and foremost human, seeking connection, wrestling with contradiction, striving to leave behind a legacy, both true and lasting. In James's story, we find a mirror of our own lives, where the rules we make may sometimes conflict with the yearnings we feel, and where love, even when bound by secrets, illuminates the darkest corridors of the heart. Relax now, as the final candle flickers and the world outside grows soft and distant. Let your thoughts drift like autumn leaves upon a silent pond, carried away from the bustle of history into the soothing embrace of twilight calm. Notice how each breath becomes slower, lighter, until all that remains is the gentle rhythm that has accompanied you from your very first moment. Soon, the images of secret tunnels and grand monuments will dissolve into muted tones, and you will rest in the hush between the stars. And as you drift toward the tender realm of dreams, know that tonight's journey through James's triumphs and contradictions carries with it a message for us all. That true courage lies in embracing our whole selves, our strengths and our vulnerabilities, so that the stories we leave behind may shine with authenticity and grace. Good night, dear listener. May your slumber be serene, your dreams sweet, and your heart at peace. And when the morning light returns, we hope you'll join us again. Subscribe to our channel so that we may share more whispered histories and gentle tales, crafted just for you, to guide you through the night and beyond. Sleep well,